Prince Alexander of Eldoria had always been curious about life beyond the golden walls of Rosethorn Palace. At 12 years old, he possessed an adventurous spirit that often led him to explore forgotten corridors and hidden passages throughout the ancient castle. His tutors frequently scolded him for his wandering habits, but Alexander couldn't resist the pull of discovery that seemed to call to him from every shadowed corner of his home. On this particular autumn morning, the crisp air carried the scent of burning leaves and distant rain. Alexander had finished his morning lessons with Master Theodore, his history tutor, earlier than expected. The old scholar had dismissed him after Alexander demonstrated his knowledge of the kingdom's founding treaties, praising the young prince for his quick understanding of complex political matters. Rather than return to his chambers as expected, Alexander decided to explore the eastern wing of the palace, an area he rarely visited. This section housed the quarters for the royal guards and various service staff. The stone corridors here lacked the ornate tapestries and gilded frames that decorated the royal family's living spaces, but Alexander found them no less interesting. The walls seemed to hold stories of loyal service and quiet dedication that fascinated him. As he wandered through the maze-like passages, Alexander began to hear voices echoing from around a corner. At first, he thought nothing of it. Palace staff often gathered in small groups during their breaks to share news and laughter. But as he drew closer, the tone of the conversation made him pause. There was something harsh and unpleasant about the sounds reaching his ears. Curiosity overcoming caution, Alexander crept closer to investigate. He pressed himself against the cold stone wall and peered around the corner into a small courtyard used by the guards for training and rest. What he saw there made his stomach turn and his heart race with a mixture of shock and anger. 3 of the senior royal guards had cornered a younger guardsman against the courtyard wall. Alexander recognized the victim immediately. It was Thomas Hartwell, a kind young man who had recently joined the royal guard. Thomas came from a humble farming family in the kingdom's countryside, and Alexander had always admired his gentle nature and dedication to duty. The 3 senior guards were much larger than Thomas, and they had clearly been tormenting him for some time. His uniform was disheveled, dirt stained his cheek, and his eyes held a mixture of fear and resignation that broke Alexander's heart. The leader of the group, a stocky man named Captain Brock, was speaking in low, menacing tones. "Listen carefully, farm boy." Captain Brock sneered, his face twisted with cruel satisfaction. "You don't belong here among real soldiers. Your father may have saved up enough coin to buy you this position, but that doesn't make you one of us. Every day you remain here is an insult to those of us who earned our places through blood and valor." Thomas straightened his shoulders, trying to maintain his dignity despite the obvious intimidation. "I've done nothing wrong, sir. I follow all orders and complete my duties faithfully. I don't understand why you treat me this way." This response only seemed to anger Captain Brock further. He stepped closer to Thomas, using his considerable height advantage to loom over the younger man. "You don't understand? Then let me make it clear for you. We don't want you here. The other men don't respect you, and they never will. You're weak, and weakness has no place in the royal guard." One of Brock's companions, a thin man with calculating eyes, chimed in with his own cruelty. "Perhaps we should test your strength, farm boy. See if you can handle a real challenge instead of just polishing swords and standing at attention." Alexander watched in horror as the 3 men began to circle Thomas like predators surrounding their prey. The young guard's hands trembled slightly, but he maintained his composure with admirable courage. Alexander could see that Thomas was badly outnumbered, and that this situation was escalating toward something much worse than mere verbal harassment. The prince felt a strange mix of emotions wash over him. Part of him wanted to rush into the courtyard immediately and put a stop to this injustice. After all, he was a member of the royal family, and these men were sworn to serve the crown. But another part of him hesitated, recognizing that his intervention might create complications he wasn't prepared to handle. As he wrestled with indecision, Alexander heard Captain Brock's voice grow even more threatening. "I think it's time we taught you a lesson about respect, boy. Something that will help you remember your place in this organization." The captain raised his hand as if preparing to strike Thomas, and in that moment, Alexander's internal conflict resolved itself completely. He could not stand by and watch an innocent person suffer abuse, regardless of the potential consequences for himself. His father, King Edward, had always taught him that true nobility came not from birthright, but from actions taken in service of justice and protection of the innocent. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Alexander stepped out from his hiding place and walked boldly into the courtyard. His sudden appearance caught all 4 guards completely off guard, and the shock on their faces would have been amusing under different circumstances. "What is happening here?" Alexander asked, his young voice carrying an authority that surprised even himself. He had learned to project confidence from years of royal training, and now that skill served him well. The 3 senior guards immediately stepped back from Thomas, their aggressive postures dissolving into nervous attention. Captain Brock's face went through several rapid changes of expression, from anger to shock to poorly concealed panic. It was clear that none of them had expected to be discovered, especially not by a member of the royal family. "Your Highness," Captain Brock stammered, executing a hasty bow. "We were just—" "That is to say, we were conducting a training exercise with Guardsman Heartwell." Alexander looked from the captain to Thomas, whose relieved expression told a very different story. The young prince had spent enough time around the palace to recognize the difference between legitimate military training and cruel harassment. What he had witnessed was clearly the latter, and he was determined not to let these men escape accountability through clever words and false explanations. Alexander studied the faces before him with the keen observation skills his mother, Queen Isabella, had taught him during their many conversations about reading people's true intentions. Captain Brock's explanation rang hollow, and the nervous energy radiating from all 3 senior guards confirmed what the prince already knew. He had interrupted something far more sinister than any training exercise. "I see," Alexander said slowly, allowing a moment of silence to stretch uncomfortably in the courtyard. He had learned this technique from watching his father handle difficult court situations. Sometimes the most powerful response was simply to let guilty parties stew in their own anxiety, while considering their next words carefully. Thomas Heartwell remained silent, but Alexander could see gratitude mixed with concern in the young guard's eyes. The farm boy clearly appreciated the unexpected intervention, but he was also worried about the potential consequences of having the prince involved in his troubles. This consideration for others, even in his own moment of distress, only reinforced Alexander's positive impression of Thomas's character. "Guardsman Heartwell," Alexander addressed the young man directly, "I would like to hear your account of this training exercise. What specific skills were being practiced when I arrived?" The question put Thomas in a difficult position, and Alexander knew it. The young guard could hardly contradict Captain Brock's story without risking even more severe treatment later. But he also couldn't lie convincingly to a member of the royal family. Alexander watched as Thomas struggled with this dilemma, his honest nature warring with his instinct for self-preservation. "Your Highness," Thomas began carefully, "the captain and his men were instructing me about my place within the guard structure. They were helping me understand the expectations that come with serving in the Royal Guard," was a diplomatic answer that avoided outright falsehood while also avoiding direct contradiction of Captain Brock's claims. Alexander appreciated the young man's intelligence in navigating such a treacherous situation, but he also recognized that this careful response was essentially a cry for help disguised as compliance. Captain Brock seemed to relax slightly at Thomas's words, perhaps believing that his intimidation tactics had been successful in securing the young guard's silence. But Alexander was far from finished with his inquiry. "Captain Brock," the prince said, turning his attention to the senior guard, "I'm curious about the training methods employed by the Royal Guard. My education has included extensive studies of military history and tactics, but I've never encountered descriptions of exercises that require 3 senior officers to instruct a single junior guardsman in such an intimate setting." The captain's face flushed red at the implied criticism, but he maintained his respectful posture. "Your Highness, the Royal Guard has many traditions and practices that may not be found in textbooks. Sometimes direct, personal instruction is necessary to ensure that all members of the Guard understand their responsibilities." Alexander nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering this explanation. In reality, he was buying time to think through his options and their potential consequences. He knew that his next actions could have far-reaching effects, not just for Thomas and the bullying guards, but for his own position within the palace hierarchy. As the heir to the throne, Alexander had been taught that his words and deeds carried weight far beyond those of ordinary people. His tutors had repeatedly emphasized the importance of careful consideration before taking action, especially in matters involving the palace staff. Yet those same tutors had also instilled in him a deep sense of justice and responsibility for protecting those who could not protect themselves. "I appreciate your dedication to thorough training, Captain," Alexander said finally. "However, I believe my father would be very interested to learn about these innovative instructional techniques. Perhaps we should arrange for you to demonstrate these methods for the king personally, so he can evaluate their effectiveness for the entire royal guard." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Captain Brock's expression showed that he understood exactly what the prince was suggesting. King Edward was known throughout the kingdom for his fierce protection of those who served the crown faithfully, and he had little patience for officers who abused their authority over subordinates. "That won't be necessary, Your Highness," Captain Brock said quickly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I believe Guardsman Heartwell has learned everything he needs to know from today's session. We were just finishing up when you arrived?" Alexander smiled pleasantly, but his eyes remained cold as he looked at each of the 3 senior guards in turn. How fortunate for all of us that the lesson concluded so conveniently. "I trust that Guardsman Hartwell's education in Royal Guard traditions is now complete?" "Yes, Your Highness," Captain Brock replied through gritted teeth. "Completely finished." "Excellent," Alexander said, his tone brightening as if discussing the weather. "Then I'm sure you gentlemen have other duties that require your attention. The palace guard schedule is quite demanding from what I understand." Taking the hint, the 3 senior guards began to file out of the courtyard, each offering stiff bows to the prince as they passed. Captain Brock lingered for a moment, his eyes burning with resentment. But even he could not afford to defy a direct dismissal from a member of the royal family. When they were finally alone, Alexander turned his full attention to Thomas Hartwell. The young guard stood at attention, but Alexander could see the exhaustion and stress in his posture. The confrontation had clearly taken a significant toll, and the prince suspected that this had not been an isolated incident. "At ease, Thomas," Alexander said gently, using the guard's first name to signal that this was now a more personal conversation. "We need to talk, but not here where others might overhear." Thomas relaxed slightly but remained wary. "Your Highness, I don't want to cause any trouble for you. What happened here? It's not your concern. I can handle my own problems." The response impressed Alexander with its dignity and consideration, but it also revealed the depth of Thomas's isolation within the guard. The young man clearly felt that he had no allies and no recourse for the treatment he was receiving. This realization strengthened Alexander's resolve to take more decisive action. "Thomas," the prince said firmly, "when someone sworn to protect my family and our kingdom is being mistreated, it absolutely becomes my concern. What I witnessed today was not training, and we both know it." For a moment, Thomas's careful composure cracked, and Alexander saw the pain and frustration that the young guard had been hiding. It was clear that the harassment had been ongoing, and that Thomas had been suffering in silence, probably believing that reporting the abuse would only make his situation worse. "Come with me," Alexander said, making a decision that he knew would change everything. "There's someone you need to meet, and there are things that need to be said. But first I want to hear the whole truth about what's been happening to you." As they walked together through the palace corridors, Alexander's mind raced with plans and possibilities. He knew that confronting Captain Brock and his cronies in the courtyard had been only the beginning. Real change would require careful strategy, powerful allies, and perhaps most importantly, the courage to challenge a system that had allowed such abuse to flourish unchecked. The young prince had always known that his royal position came with great responsibility, but today had shown him that sometimes the most important use of power was to protect those who had none. Thomas Hartwell deserved justice, and Alexander was determined to ensure that he received it regardless of the cost to himself. Alexander led Thomas through a series of lesser-known passages that eventually brought them to a small private study tucked away in the library's upper level. This room had become the prince's personal refuge, a place where he could think and read without the constant interruptions that plagued the main royal quarters. Tall windows overlooked the palace gardens, and comfortable chairs surrounded a small fireplace that Alexander often used during his solitary study sessions. "Please, sit down," Alexander said, gesturing to one of the chairs while he moved to close the door behind them. The click of the latch seemed to release some of the tension that had been building in both of them since leaving the courtyard. Thomas remained standing, still maintaining the formal posture expected of a royal guard in the presence of a prince. "Your Highness, I should return to my duties. My absence will be noticed and questions will be asked." "Thomas," Alexander said with gentle firmness, "I am giving you a direct order to sit down and speak with me honestly. Your duties right now are here in this room, helping me understand what has been happening within my family's guard." Reluctantly, Thomas settled into one of the chairs, though he remained rigid and uncomfortable. Alexander took the seat across from him, deliberately choosing to sit at the same level rather than behind the room's desk, where he would have held a position of obvious authority. He wanted this conversation to feel as equal as possible, given their different stations. For several moments they sat in silence while Alexander considered how to begin. He had learned from his parents that the most difficult conversations often required patience and careful approach. Thomas had clearly been taught not to complain or cause trouble, values that Alexander normally respected but that now worked against getting the truth he needed. "How long have you been serving in the Royal Guard?" Alexander asked, starting with a question that felt safe and factual. 6 months, Your Highness," Thomas replied promptly. "I was accepted into service on the first day of spring, after completing the required training and examinations." "And how long have Captain Brock and his associates been treating you the way I witnessed today?" Thomas hesitated, clearly wrestling with his instinct to protect himself through silence. "Your Highness, I don't want to make accusations against my superior officers. The Royal Guard has its own ways of handling internal matters." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "Thomas, what I saw today was not the Royal Guard handling internal matters. What I saw was 3 grown men intimidating and threatening someone who has done nothing wrong. That's not discipline or training. That's cruelty, and it has no place in service to the crown." The sincerity in the prince's voice seemed to break through some of Thomas's defenses. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since they had sat down he made direct eye contact with Alexander. "It started almost immediately after I arrived," Thomas admitted quietly. "Captain Brock made it clear that he didn't think I belonged here. He said that positions in the Royal Guard should go to men from military families, not farm boys who had never held a sword before joining. But you passed all the same tests and training as everyone else," Alexander pointed out. "Your acceptance into the Guard proves your capability." "That's what I told myself at first," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger as he began to open up. "But when every day brings new humiliation, new reminders that you're unwanted, it becomes hard to remember your own worth. They assign me the worst duties, exclude me from important briefings, and make sure the other guards know that associating with me could bring them similar treatment." Alexander felt his anger rising again, but he forced himself to remain calm and focused. Getting emotional would not help Thomas or solve the underlying problem. Instead, he needed to gather information and develop a strategy that would create lasting change. "Tell me about the other guards," Alexander said. "Are they all participants in this treatment, or are some of them simply afraid to speak up?" Thomas considered this question carefully before answering. "Most of them just ignore what's happening. They're not cruel themselves, but they won't risk their own positions to help me. There are a few who have been kind when Captain Brock isn't around. Small gestures, words of encouragement. But they can't do much without putting themselves in danger." This information gave Alexander hope. If most of the guards were simply passive rather than actively malicious, then changing the culture might be possible with the right approach. The key would be addressing the leadership problem while giving the decent guards permission and protection to stand up for what was right. "Has anyone in the guard hierarchy above Captain Brock been made aware of this situation?" Alexander asked. "No, Your Highness," Thomas said quickly. "Captain Brock reports directly to Commander Walsh, and they've served together for many years. Even if I could prove what's been happening, I doubt my word would carry much weight against such an established officer." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. Commander Walsh was indeed a respected veteran who had served the royal family faithfully for over 2 decades. However, the prince also knew that the commander was an honorable man who would not tolerate abuse of authority if presented with clear evidence of wrongdoing. "Thomas," Alexander said, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "I want you to do something for me. I want you to continue your duties as normal. But I want you to keep a detailed record of every incident of harassment or mistreatment. Write down dates, times, witnesses, and exactly what was said or done. Can you do that without putting yourself in additional danger? I think so, Your Highness, Thomas replied, though uncertainty colored his voice. But what purpose would such records serve? It would still be my word against theirs. Alexander smiled, and for the first time since their conversation began, his expression held genuine confidence. Leave that part to me. I have some advantages in this situation that you don't, and I intend to use them. But I need your help to gather the evidence that will make our case undeniable. Our case? Thomas asked, surprise evident in his voice. Thomas, Alexander said seriously, you didn't ask for my help, but you have it regardless. What's happening to you is wrong, and I won't stand by and allow it to continue. However, I want to handle this situation in a way that doesn't just solve your immediate problem, but prevents it from happening to others in the future. For the first time since Alexander had known him, Thomas smiled. It was a small, tentative expression, but it transformed his entire appearance and revealed the genuine warmth that lay beneath his careful guard. Thank you, Your Highness, Thomas said softly. I never expected— I hoped that someday someone might notice, but I never imagined that help would come from you. Why not from me? Alexander asked, genuinely curious about Thomas's perspective. Because you're the prince, Thomas said, as if this explained everything. You have important matters to concern yourself with. Affairs of state, education, preparing for your future responsibilities. The problems of one lowly guard seem insignificant compared to all of that. Alexander considered this response for a long moment before replying. Thomas, my tutors have taught me many things about leadership and responsibility. But today, you've taught me something that no book or lesson ever could. You've shown me that the true measure of a leader isn't how well he handles great matters of state, but how he treats the people who serve him when no one is watching. I don't understand, Your Highness. Captain Brock and his friends think they can abuse their authority because they believe no one important enough to stop them will ever find out, Alexander explained. They prey on your isolation and silence, counting on the fact that you have no powerful allies to defend you. But they made a critical error in their calculations. What error? Thomas asked. Alexander's smile widened and his eyes gleamed with the anticipation of justice soon to be served. They forgot that sometimes the most important person in the kingdom might be wandering through forgotten corridors, curious about the lives of those who dedicate themselves to protecting his family. As they prepared to leave the private study, Alexander felt a sense of purpose and determination that was entirely new to him. For the first time in his young life, he was about to use his position and privileges not for his own benefit, but to right a wrong and protect someone who could not protect himself. The game was about to change dramatically, and Captain Brock had no idea what was coming for him. Over the next 3 days, Alexander threw himself into his investigation with the same intensity he usually reserved for his most challenging academic studies. He had always been a methodical thinker, preferring to understand all aspects of a problem before attempting to solve it, and this situation demanded nothing less than his complete analytical attention. The first step in his plan involved gathering intelligence about the guards' daily routines and power structures. Alexander began taking longer walks through the palace, timing his movements to coincide with shift changes and break periods. He made mental notes of who spoke to whom, which guards seemed isolated like Thomas, and how Captain Brock interacted with different members of the unit. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Thomas was not Captain Brock's only target. The prince observed subtle but unmistakable signs that at least 2 other junior guards were receiving similar treatment. One was Marcus, a young man from the kingdom's northern territories whose accent marked him as an outsider. The other was David, whose slight build made him an easy target for physical intimidation. More disturbing still was Alexander's realization that this pattern of abuse had likely been continuing for years. During conversations with palace staff who had worked there longer, he learned that several promising young guards had mysteriously requested transfers to other duties or left royal service altogether after brief tenures. At the time, these departures had been attributed to the demanding nature of royal guard duty, but Alexander now suspected a more sinister explanation. On the second day of his investigation, Alexander made a crucial decision to involve someone he trusted completely, Sir William Thornfield, his personal mentor and combat instructor. Sir William was a former knight who had served Alexander's grandfather with distinction before transitioning to his current role as the prince's trainer. More importantly, he was one of the few adults in the palace who spoke to Alexander as a person rather than just a title. Alexander found Sir William in the training courtyard where they usually practiced sword work. But instead of beginning their lesson immediately, the prince requested a private conversation. Sir William, a perceptive man who had noticed changes in his student's demeanor over the past few days, readily agreed. "Something is troubling you, Alexander," Sir William observed as they sat on a bench overlooking the practice area. "You've been distracted during our lessons, and I've noticed you spending more time observing the guards than usual. What's on your mind?" Alexander had prepared for this conversation carefully, knowing that Sir William's reaction would largely determine whether his plan could succeed. He needed an adult ally who understood both the political complexities of the palace and the practical realities of military hierarchy. "Sir William," Alexander began, "what would you do if you discovered that someone in a position of authority was systematically abusing that power to harm people under their command?" The knight's expression grew serious. "That's a weighty question, lad. Are we speaking hypothetically, or has something specific prompted this inquiry?" "Something very specific," Alexander replied, and then proceeded to tell Sir William everything he had witnessed and learned about the situation with Thomas and the other guards. He spoke carefully and precisely, sticking to facts rather than emotions, presenting his case like the legal arguments he had studied in his governance classes. Sir William listened without interruption, his weathered face growing darker as the story progressed. When Alexander finished, the knight was quiet for several long minutes, clearly processing the implications of what he had heard. "These are serious accusations, Alexander," Sir William said finally. "If what you're telling me is true, then Captain Brock has violated every principle of honorable leadership that the Royal Guard is supposed to embody. But proving such allegations and addressing them appropriately will require careful handling." "I know," Alexander replied. "That's why I need your help. I can't simply go to my father with second-hand accounts and expect him to take action against a senior officer. I need evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." Sir William nodded approvingly. "Your instincts are sound. King Edward values justice, but he also values due process and fairness. He won't act on accusations alone, no matter who makes them. What do you have in mind?" Alexander outlined his preliminary plan, which involved documented observation of the guards' interactions, careful questioning of other palace staff, and most crucially, creating a situation where Captain Brock's behavior could be witnessed by unimpeachable authorities. "The challenge," Alexander explained, "is that Captain Brock is too smart to abuse his authority when he knows important people might be watching. We need to catch him when he believes he's safe from observation." Sir William stroked his beard thoughtfully. "There might be a way to accomplish that. Commander Walsh has been planning a comprehensive review of guard procedures and protocols. If we could arrange for him to conduct some of those reviews at unexpected times, in unexpected places, he might witness behavior that Captain Brock doesn't have time to hide," Alexander finished, understanding immediately where Sir William's thinking was leading. "Exactly. But we would need to be very careful about how we suggest this to the commander. He's an intelligent man who would become suspicious if he felt he was being manipulated into discovering specific problems." Over the next hour, Alexander and Sir William refined their strategy. They would need to plant seeds of concern about guard morale and effectiveness without directly accusing anyone of wrongdoing. They would need to guide Commander Walsh toward his own discovery of the problems rather than simply presenting him with conclusions. The key element of their plan involved Alexander's unique position within the palace hierarchy. As the prince, he had legitimate reasons to be interested in the effectiveness and morale of those sworn to protect his family. He could request briefings, ask probing questions, and express concerns that would prompt further investigation. "There's one more thing we need to consider," Sir William said as their planning session neared its end. "Captain Brock isn't going to simply accept defeat if he realizes he's under scrutiny. Men like him often become more dangerous when they feel cornered. We need to ensure that Thomas and the other victims are protected throughout this process." Alexander had been thinking about this problem as well. "I've been considering assigning Thomas to special duties that would keep him closer to the royal quarters and away from Captain Brock's direct supervision." Perhaps as an additional security escort for my educational outings or library research. That's brilliant, Sir William said with genuine admiration. It provides legitimate protection, while also giving you regular opportunities to monitor his well-being and gather additional information. As they finalized their plans, Alexander felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He was about to undertake the most complex and important challenge of his young life, one that would test not only his intelligence and courage, but also his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics. "Sir William," Alexander said as they prepared to part, "why do you think Captain Brock behaves this way? What drives someone to abuse their authority over people who can't fight back?" The knight considered this question carefully before responding. "Power can reveal the worst aspects of a person's character, Alexander. Some people, when given authority over others, use it to build themselves up by tearing others down. They mistake fear for respect and cruelty for strength. Captain Brock likely sees kindness as weakness and believes that harsh treatment makes better soldiers." "But that's not true, is it?" Alexander asked. "No," Sir William replied firmly. "True strength comes from protecting those who need protection, not from preying on them. A real leader inspires loyalty through example and earns respect through character. What Captain Brock is doing isn't leadership, it's cowardice disguised as authority." As Alexander walked back toward the main palace, his mind was already racing ahead to the next phases of his plan. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate process of raising concerns with Commander Walsh. Within a week, if everything went according to plan, Captain Brock would find himself facing the consequences of his actions. The prince smiled grimly as he climbed the marble steps toward his family's quarters. Captain Brock had made the mistake of assuming that his victims had no allies and no recourse. He was about to learn just how wrong that assumption had been. The opportunity Alexander had been waiting for arrived sooner than expected, though it came in a form he hadn't entirely anticipated. On the morning of the 4th day after his conversation with Sir William, a message arrived from his father requesting Alexander's presence in the throne room for a meeting with foreign dignitaries from the neighboring kingdom of Valyria. This diplomatic gathering provided the perfect cover for Alexander's plan. Foreign visits always heightened security protocols and required additional guard presence throughout the palace. More importantly, Commander Walsh would be personally overseeing all security arrangements, giving Alexander the chance to express his concerns about guard readiness and morale. Alexander found Commander Walsh in the guard captain's office, reviewing duty assignments and security protocols with his usual methodical attention to detail. The commander was a tall, stern man whose gray hair and weathered face spoke of decades of military service. Despite his intimidating appearance, Alexander had always found him to be fair and approachable. "Your Highness," Commander Walsh said, rising from his desk as Alexander entered. "I wasn't expecting you this morning. Is there something you need regarding today's diplomatic proceedings?" "Actually, Commander, I wanted to discuss a concern I've been having about our security arrangements," Alexander replied, adopting the serious tone he had practiced for this conversation. "I've been observing our guards more closely recently, and I'm worried about morale and cohesion within the unit." Commander Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's an unusual concern for someone your age, Your Highness. What specifically have you observed that troubles you?" Alexander had rehearsed this response carefully, knowing that he needed to raise concerns without making direct accusations. "I've noticed that some of our newer guards seem isolated from their colleagues. They appear nervous and distracted during their duties, which concerns me from a security standpoint. If our guards aren't working as a unified team, it could create vulnerabilities that our enemies might exploit." The commander nodded thoughtfully. "You make a valid point. Guard cohesion is indeed crucial for effective security. Have you observed any specific incidents or behaviors that support your concerns?" "Nothing I could point to as definitively problematic," Alexander said, choosing his words carefully. "But I've noticed tension during shift changes and what appears to be exclusion of certain guards from informal briefings and discussions. I'm concerned that personal conflicts might be affecting professional performance." Commander Walsh leaned back in his chair, clearly taking Alexander's observations seriously. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Your Highness. It's possible that I've been too focused on procedural matters to notice interpersonal issues within the ranks. Perhaps I should conduct some unscheduled evaluations to assess the situation more thoroughly." "That sounds like an excellent idea," Alexander agreed, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. In fact, given today's heightened security requirements, it might be valuable to observe how our guards handle stress and coordination under pressure. Indeed, the commander mused. I think I'll make some impromptu visits to various guard posts throughout the day, particularly in areas where newer personnel are stationed. If there are problems with morale or integration, they're likely to become more apparent during high-stress situations. Alexander left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic about the first phase of his plan. Commander Walsh had accepted his concerns without suspicion and was now primed to look for exactly the kind of behavior that Captain Brock regularly displayed. The next step would be ensuring that the commander's observations occurred at the right time and place. Sir William had suggested that the best opportunity would come during the afternoon shift change, when Captain Brock typically conducted his harshest interactions with the junior guards. The captain seemed to prefer these moments because most of the senior staff were either busy with other duties or changing shifts themselves, leaving little supervision of his activities. To increase the chances of the right encounter occurring, Alexander had quietly arranged for Thomas to be assigned to guard duty in the eastern corridor during the afternoon shift. This area was both strategically important for the diplomatic proceedings and somewhat isolated from the main security hub, making it a likely location for Captain Brock to assert his authority without fear of observation. As the afternoon approached, Alexander positioned himself in the library's upper level, where he could observe the eastern corridor through a window, while maintaining the appearance of studying for his lessons. From this vantage point, he could see when Commander Walsh began his impromptu inspections and signal Sir William if any adjustments to their plan became necessary. At precisely 2 o'clock, Alexander spotted Commander Walsh emerging from the main guard station and beginning his walking inspection of the palace's security posts. The commander moved methodically from station to station, observing guard positions and asking questions about protocols and procedures. Meanwhile, Captain Brock was conducting his own afternoon review of guard assignments, moving through the corridors with his characteristic swagger and intimidating presence. Alexander watched as the captain stopped to speak with several guards. Noting the obvious tension and discomfort his presence created among the junior personnel, the moment Alexander had been hoping for arrived when Captain Brock encountered Thomas at his assigned post in the eastern corridor. From his elevated position, Alexander couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was unmistakable. Captain Brock loomed over Thomas, gesturing aggressively and clearly delivering another round of his typical intimidation tactics. What Captain Brock didn't notice was Commander Walsh approaching from the opposite end of the corridor, drawn by Alexander's earlier suggestion to pay particular attention to areas where newer guards were stationed. The commander's approach was quiet and professional, but Alexander could see that he was already observing the interaction between Brock and Thomas with growing concern. Alexander held his breath as the scene unfolded below. This was the moment that would determine whether months of careful planning and investigation would finally bear fruit. Commander Walsh moved closer, now clearly within hearing range of whatever Captain Brock was saying to Thomas. From his window, Alexander could see the exact moment when Commander Walsh realized what he was witnessing. The veteran officer's posture stiffened and his face darkened with unmistakable anger. He quickened his pace, no longer attempting to remain unobserved. "Captain Brock," Commander Walsh's voice carried clearly through the corridor, causing both Brock and Thomas to turn in surprise. Alexander couldn't make out the specific words that followed, but the commander's tone left no doubt about his displeasure with what he had observed. Captain Brock's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the confident arrogance he typically displayed, he became defensive and nervous, clearly recognizing that he had been caught engaging in behavior he couldn't easily explain or justify. The confrontation lasted several intense minutes, during which Alexander watched Commander Walsh question both Brock and Thomas about what had been occurring. Thomas appeared to be answering honestly, while Captain Brock seemed to be struggling to provide satisfactory explanations for his conduct. Finally, Commander Walsh dismissed Thomas from his post and continued his conversation with Captain Brock in private. Alexander could see that the discussion had become heated, with the commander's anger becoming increasingly apparent despite his professional demeanor. When the conversation ended, Captain Brock walked away with obvious frustration and barely controlled rage, while Commander Walsh stood in the corridor for several minutes, clearly processing what he had learned and considering his next actions. Alexander quietly left his observation post and made his way to Sir William's training area, where they had agreed to meet after the plan was executed. His mentor was waiting for him, having observed portions of the confrontation from his own strategic position. "Well?" Sir William asked as Alexander approached. "Commander Walsh saw everything," Alexander reported, unable to suppress his satisfaction. Captain Brock was caught red-handed intimidating Thomas, and from the commander's reaction, I don't think he was fooled by whatever explanations Brock tried to offer. "That's excellent news," Sir William said. "But remember, this is just the beginning. Captain Brock will likely try to retaliate against Thomas and anyone else he suspects of being involved in exposing him. We need to be prepared for the next phase of this situation." Alexander nodded soberly. "I know, but at least now Thomas won't be suffering alone. And other guards won't have to wonder if anyone in authority cares about what happens to them." "You've done well, lad," Sir William said with genuine pride. "You've shown wisdom, courage, and most importantly, compassion for those who needed your help. These are the qualities that will make you a great king someday." As they walked back toward the main palace, Alexander felt a deep sense of satisfaction mixed with anticipation for what would come next. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and Captain Brock's reign of intimidation was about to come to an end. The next morning brought news that confirmed Alexander's hopes while also introducing new complications he hadn't fully anticipated. Commander Walsh had wasted no time in launching a formal investigation into Captain Brock's conduct. But the process was proving more complex than a simple case of witnessed misconduct. Alexander learned about these developments during breakfast with his parents, when his father mentioned receiving an unusual report from the guard commander about serious disciplinary issues within the royal security force. King Edward's expression was troubled as he discussed the matter with Queen Isabella, clearly concerned about the implications for palace security and morale. "Commander Walsh has requested permission to conduct a comprehensive review of guard protocols and personnel management," King Edward explained to his wife. "Apparently there have been significant problems with the treatment of junior staff that have gone unaddressed for some time." Queen Isabella, always perceptive about matters involving the welfare of those who served their family, asked the questions that Alexander had been hoping someone would raise. "What kind of problems, Edward? Are we talking about simple miscommunication or something more serious?" "More serious, I'm afraid," the king replied grimly. Walsh indicated that he has evidence of systematic harassment and abuse of authority by at least one senior officer. He's being very careful about the investigation, but he seems convinced that immediate action is necessary. Alexander remained quiet during this conversation, knowing that showing too much interest or knowledge about the situation might raise uncomfortable questions about his own involvement. However, he was encouraged by his parents' obvious concern and their trust in Commander Walsh's judgment. After breakfast, Alexander made his way to the library under the pretense of studying, but his real goal was to check on Thomas and assess how Captain Brock was responding to the previous day's confrontation. What he discovered when he reached Thomas's new assignment in the royal quarters was both encouraging and deeply troubling. Thomas appeared to be in good spirits for the first time since Alexander had known him. His posture was more confident, his expression more relaxed, and he seemed genuinely hopeful about his future with the guard. However, when Alexander managed to speak with him privately, Thomas revealed that Captain Brock's reaction to being caught had been swift and vindictive. "He cornered me after the evening shift last night," Thomas explained quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of fear and determination. "He was furious, Your Highness. He accused me of conspiring against him and threatened to make my life unbearable if I cooperated with Commander Walsh's investigation." Alexander felt his anger flare at this news, but he forced himself to remain calm and focused. "What exactly did he say? And were there any witnesses to these threats?" "He was careful to make sure we were alone," Thomas replied. "But he made it clear that he suspects someone in authority put Commander Walsh up to investigating him. He doesn't know about your involvement, but he's determined to find out who's behind his troubles." This information concerned Alexander greatly. Captain Brock was clearly desperate and angry, a combination that could lead to increasingly reckless behavior. Worse still, the captain might begin targeting other guards in an attempt to discover who had betrayed him. "Has he approached any of the other guards who've been mistreated?" Alexander asked. Yes, Thomas confirmed. Marcus told me that Captain Brock questioned him aggressively this morning, trying to get him to admit to complaining about his treatment. David has been avoiding the captain entirely, which probably makes him look even more suspicious. Alexander realized that his plan, while successful in exposing Captain Brock's behavior, had also created a dangerous situation for the very people he was trying to protect. The captain was now actively hunting for those who had dared to challenge his authority, and his victims were more vulnerable than ever. Thomas, Alexander said seriously, I need you to do something for me. I want you to tell Marcus and David to document any contact they have with Captain Brock from now on. If he threatens or intimidates any of you, I want detailed records of what happened. And if you feel that you're in immediate danger, I want you to come to me or Sir William immediately. Your Highness, I don't want to put you at risk by involving you further in this situation, Thomas protested. Captain Brock is becoming desperate, and desperate people do unpredictable things. That's exactly why I need to stay involved, Alexander replied firmly. You and the others are under my protection now, whether Captain Brock realizes it or not. He may not know about my role in exposing him, but I'm not going to abandon you to face his retaliation alone. Later that afternoon, Alexander's concerns about Captain Brock's desperation proved to be well-founded. Sir William sought him out with disturbing news about the captain's increasingly erratic behavior. He's been questioning guards throughout the palace, Sir William reported, his expression grim. Not just the obvious targets like Thomas and Marcus, but anyone who might have had reason to observe his conduct or report it to higher authority. He's creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that's affecting the entire guard unit. Has Commander Walsh noticed this behavior? Alexander asked. Oh, he's definitely noticed, Sir William confirmed. In fact, Brock's current conduct is providing even more evidence of his unfitness for command. The man is essentially destroying his own defense by acting like someone with a guilty conscience. But is that enough to protect the guards he's targeting? Alexander pressed. I'm worried that he might escalate to physical intimidation or worse before the investigation concludes. Sir William's expression grew even more serious. That's actually what I came to discuss with you. Commander Walsh has asked me to recommend temporary reassignments for the guards who have been most directly affected by this situation. He wants to remove them from Brock's immediate authority while the investigation continues. This news brought Alexander considerable relief, but he also recognized that such obvious protective measures would confirm Captain Brock's suspicions about organized opposition to his authority. The captain would undoubtedly interpret these reassignments as proof that his victims had powerful allies working against him. What kind of reassignments is the commander considering? Alexander asked. Enhanced security details for the royal family, Sir William replied with a slight smile. Starting tomorrow, Thomas, Marcus, and David will be assigned to rotating duties that keep them in close proximity to you and your parents. Officially, this is a response to increased security concerns following yesterday's diplomatic meetings. Unofficially, it removes them from Captain Brock's direct supervision while providing them with implicit protection. Alexander admired the elegance of this solution. Commander Walsh was simultaneously protecting the victims, gathering evidence, and making it clear to Captain Brock that his behavior was being closely monitored. However, Alexander also realized that this escalation would likely provoke an even more extreme response from the desperate captain. Sir William, Alexander said thoughtfully, I think Captain Brock is going to do something drastic soon. He's losing control of the situation, and men like him don't accept defeat gracefully. We need to be prepared for him to make one final reckless attempt to regain his authority, or punish those he blames for his downfall. I've been thinking the same thing, Sir William agreed, which is why I've arranged for additional security measures that Captain Brock doesn't know about. If he tries anything foolish, he'll find himself facing consequences he hasn't anticipated. As evening approached, Alexander felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension about the events he had set in motion. Justice was finally being served, but the price of that justice might still prove higher than anyone had anticipated. Captain Brock was cornered and dangerous, and cornered animals were capable of doing tremendous damage before they were finally subdued. The young prince spent that night wondering what desperate measure Captain Brock would attempt, and whether all of his careful planning would be enough to protect the innocent people who had become pawns in this larger struggle for justice and accountability. Captain Brock's final desperate gambit came 3 days later, and it exceeded even Alexander's worst expectations for reckless behavior. The captain had apparently decided that his only hope of survival lay in discrediting the investigation entirely by creating a security incident that would distract attention from his own misconduct. The crisis began during the early morning hours when Captain Brock falsely reported a potential security breach in the palace's eastern wing. He claimed to have discovered evidence that unauthorized individuals had been accessing restricted areas, possibly for the purpose of gathering intelligence about royal security procedures. His report was detailed enough to trigger immediate emergency protocols, requiring the attention of Commander Walsh and other senior staff. However, Captain Brock had made a critical error in his desperation. Unknown to him, Sir William had been conducting discreet overnight security patrols in exactly the areas where Brock claimed the breach had occurred. When Commander Walsh investigated the reported security incident, Sir William was able to provide testimony that completely contradicted the captain's account. Alexander learned about these developments when Sir William woke him before dawn with news that the situation was rapidly reaching its conclusion. "Captain Brock has overplayed his hand," the knight explained as they made their way to Commander Walsh's office. "He's been caught filing false reports and attempting to manipulate a security investigation. Combined with everything else we've documented, this gives the commander all the evidence he needs to take decisive action." When they arrived at the guard headquarters, they found Commander Walsh in conference with 2 other senior officers, reviewing written statements and evidence that had been collected over the past several days. The commander looked up as Alexander and Sir William entered, his expression grim but determined. "Your Highness," Commander Walsh said, rising to acknowledge Alexander's presence, "I owe you an apology and a debt of gratitude. Your observations about guard morale led to the discovery of serious misconduct that I should have noticed and addressed much sooner." "You don't owe me any apology, Commander," Alexander replied respectfully. "You acted swiftly and thoroughly once the problems were brought to your attention. That's all anyone could ask of a leader in your position." Commander Walsh nodded appreciatively, then continued with his report. "Captain Brock has been placed under arrest pending formal court-martial proceedings. The charges include abuse of authority, harassment of subordinates, filing false reports, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Based on the evidence we've gathered, I'm confident that he will be stripped of rank and expelled from royal service." "What about the guards who were being mistreated?" Alexander asked, his primary concern remaining the welfare of Thomas and the others. "They've all been interviewed extensively, and their accounts have been corroborated by multiple witnesses," the commander replied. "Thomas Hartwell, in particular, showed remarkable courage in providing detailed testimony about the harassment he endured. All 3 of the affected guards will be receiving formal commendations for their perseverance and dedication to duty under difficult circumstances." Sir William smiled at this news. "And their future assignments?" "All 3 will be remaining with the Royal Guard, with opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than the arbitrary preferences of their superiors," Commander Walsh said firmly. "I'm also implementing new procedures for reporting and investigating complaints about officer conduct to ensure that similar situations cannot develop undetected in the future." Alexander felt a deep sense of satisfaction at hearing these outcomes, but he was also curious about one remaining detail. "Commander, may I ask how you plan to address the culture that allowed this situation to persist for so long?" Commander Walsh's expression became more thoughtful. "That's perhaps the most important question you've raised, Your Highness. It's not enough to simply remove Captain Brock and hope that similar problems don't arise again. I'm working with Sir William and other trusted advisors to develop comprehensive reforms to our training, supervision, and accountability procedures." "What kind of reforms?" Alexander asked, genuinely interested in the details. "Regular anonymous surveys of guard morale and treatment concerns," the commander began. "Rotation of supervisory assignments to prevent the development of isolated power structures. Formal mentorship programs pairing senior and junior guards to provide support and guidance. And most importantly, clear consequences for officers who abuse their authority, regardless of their rank or length of service." As the meeting concluded, Alexander found himself reflecting on the broader lessons of the experience he had just lived through. He had always understood intellectually that leadership required protecting those who could not protect themselves, But this situation had taught him what that principle meant in practical, human terms. Thomas Hartwell sought out Alexander later that day to express his gratitude and to share some surprising news about his own future plans. They met in the same private study where they had first discussed the harassment, but the atmosphere now was completely different from their earlier conversation. "Your Highness," Thomas began, "I wanted to thank you personally for everything you did to help me and the others. I know it would have been much easier for you to simply ignore what you witnessed that day in the courtyard." "Thomas," Alexander replied, "you don't need to thank me for doing what was right. If anything, I should be thanking you for having the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most." Thomas smiled, the same genuine expression that had first convinced Alexander of the young guard's good character. "I also wanted to tell you about some decisions I've made about my future. Commander Walsh has offered me the opportunity to join a new training program for junior officers, with the goal of eventually becoming a guard supervisor myself." "That's wonderful news," Alexander exclaimed, genuinely pleased by this development. "You'll make an excellent officer, Thomas. You have exactly the kind of character and integrity that the Royal Guard needs in its leadership." "I hope so," Thomas replied. "I want to make sure that no other young guard ever has to endure what I went through. If I can help create an environment where people are judged by their abilities and character, rather than their backgrounds or connections, then something positive will have come from all of this." Over the following weeks, Alexander watched as the promised reforms were implemented throughout the Guard organization. The changes were not dramatic or immediately visible, but they created a foundation for sustained improvement in how the Guards treated each other and carried out their duties. More importantly for Alexander's own development, the experience had taught him invaluable lessons about the practical exercise of leadership and responsibility. He had learned that power was most meaningful when used to protect others, that justice sometimes required patience and strategy rather than immediate action, and that even young people could make significant differences in the lives of those around them. 6 months later, as Alexander observed Thomas Hartwell leading a training session for new Guard recruits, the prince reflected on how profoundly the events in that small courtyard had changed multiple lives. Captain Brock was gone, serving time in a military prison for his crimes. The Guards under his former command were thriving in an environment of mutual respect and support, and Alexander himself had gained a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to serve others through leadership. Thomas noticed Alexander, watching from across the training yard, and offered a respectful nod of acknowledgement. In that simple gesture, Alexander saw recognition not just of royal authority, but of the partnership they had formed in pursuit of justice and positive change. The young prince smiled and returned the nod, knowing that this experience had prepared him for the greater challenges and responsibilities that lay ahead in his future as king. He had learned that true leadership was not about commanding others but about serving them, protecting them, and creating conditions where everyone could contribute their best efforts to the common good. As he walked back toward the palace, Alexander felt confident that when his time came to rule the kingdom, he would remember the lessons taught by a brave young guard who had shown him the difference between authority and leadership, between power and justice, and between turning away from injustice and having the courage to confront it head-on.